Welcome everybody to the Spotlight on Translation event at WordFeast, plein feu sur la traduction littéraire. We're broadcasting from a number of different places today, from the unceded territory of the Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq people, where the treaties of peace and friendship were signed for the Crown in 1725 and established the rules for an ongoing relationship between nations, as well as from the traditional territories of the Niitsitapi people in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. And we're here for this amazing event in a conversation between Joshua Whitehead, Arianne Des Rochers, and I, Sophie Lavoie, who will be your host for this event tonight. The event is sponsored by WordFeast, which is Fredericton's literary festival, and the Literary Translations Association of Canada, l'Association des traducteurs et traductrices littéraires du Canada. As I said, my name is Sophie Lavoie, and I am a literary translator who resides in Fredericton. The goal of the Spotlight on Translation series is to hear a little bit more about the art of translation today, why it matters so much, as well as how it can open doors. And our author and translator today are going to be sharing a lot of information about that in our questions. So I'm just going to give you a quick introduction to our author and our translator, and then I'm going to start firing away with the questions for them, so get them talking a little bit. Joshua Whitehead is a two-spirit, self-proclaimed indigiqueer, ojibwé-crie, member of the Peguis First Nation in Treaty 1 territory, which is located in Manitoba. He is currently a PhD student, lecturer and Killam scholar at the University of Calgary, where he studies Indigenous literatures and cultures with a focus on gender and sexuality. He is the author of a book of poetry called Full Metal Indigiqueer, which was published in 2017 by Talon Books and was shortlisted for the inaugural Indigenous Voices Award and the Stephen J. Stevenson Award for Poetry. He is also the author of Jonny Appleseed, the book that we're interested in today, which was longlisted for the Giller Prize and shortlisted, among other, for a number of prizes, including the Indigenous Voices Award and the Governor General's Literary Award, and won, congratulations Joshua, the Lambda Literary Award for Gay Fiction and the George Bugnett Award for Fiction as well. He's also edited a collection called Love After the End. I love this title, Two-Spirit Utopias and Dystopias. And you can find his work, if you're looking for it, in a number of quality literary journals, including Prairie Fire, Art Poetry Magazine, Fredericton's own Fiddlehead Magazine, and Red Rising Magazine, among others. If you Google him, you'll find him. So we're very happy to have you here with us today, Joshua. And our translator is Arianne Des Rochers. Very happy to have you as well, Arianne. Arianne is a literary translator, scholar, and professor of European descent, originally from Montreal. She's currently an assistant professor at the University of Moncton in New Brunswick, and also a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. Her translation of Jonny Appleseed in its French version came out in 2019, and it's one of her latest, along with translations of Leanne Betesomake-Simpson and Glenn Coulthard. This, she says, is the most challenging and delightful translation project she ever worked on. So we're very happy to be talking a little bit more about this translation in our event today. So I'm going to dive right into my questions, and I know both of you will have answers to some of the questions. I want to first ask you both a little bit about the origin of the project. So Josh, what's it like to learn that your book's going to be translated? And Arianne, maybe you can share a little bit about how you came to the project as well. So we'll give you, Josh, don't forget to turn on your mic.
I'm back. Oh yeah. So Jonny was going through all these accolades really quickly, which was surprising to me. And then Arsenal Pulp, Brian Lamb with them, noted that we wanted to have a French translation. And I was beyond excited to have. None of my work has been published, and me and Arianne joke about how one might try to translate Full Metal, which is a difficult undertaking, I think. But yeah, so it was announced that it would be translated, and I was beyond excited, beyond humble, but also a little nervous because I would say first and foremost, the book was primarily already kind of wrangling with having to be already written in and in the style of kind of Western conventions, such as English. So I was already trying to kind of, I guess, indigenize it as much as I could with my kind of blossoming understanding of Nehioiwin, or the Cree language, and all of my works from Full Metal to Jonny to the anthology to my forthcoming work, which is titled Making Love with the Land. It's already peppered with more and more Cree as I kind of learn more. But yeah, I was very excited, but nervous at the same time. I guess my first, prior to having signed on with anyone, was like, oh, like we're already thinking and writing and publishing in English, which is not my first and foremost native language. And then to also be putting it into the kind of secondary primary language of Canada was like I think some kind of, was an ethic I was kind of debating. I was like, should it? But ultimately we decided in terms of like the marketing industry that we wanted to do that. But also personally, I also wanted to do that because I'm very interested in translation. I think a lot of my own work in all of my, like my novel, my poetry, my nonfiction forthcoming, is already kind of doing the work of translation from English to Cree, but then I'm also really interested in etymologies. So I'm continually working in like a Latin vein as well. So we got the call and we were looking for translators, and then I was introduced, well, we had known each other prior, but I was introduced to the wonderful Arianne, and I think it was just like the perfect match. Because I think we took the book in the French translation following the same path, but I think we went, I'm sure you would agree as well, but I think we went down some rabbit holes and we took some different turns, and we had some difficulties, and I would say a little bit in thinking about translating kind of in a triad from English to Cree to French, and then also trying to think about maybe some of the kind of etymological workings I was doing as well. But for me, it was just like the perfect match. I had the absolute best time. And it was really interesting because there's a few people in my life. So my previous partner / good friend now was also like very heavily invested while I was writing this novel. And there are very much, I would say, biotextual elements of him in the novel and of myself. And so it was nice to kind of have him be a part of the process. He was also part of the audiobook process, the editing process. But I would say it was delightful and beautiful to have someone who knows the book as well as I do, if not better. And I think for me, that was the most beautiful process of the translation, was having Arianne there as well. But someone who was willing to do the care work, I would say, for my little glitter princess. So he was in good hands in all relations that he's been with, and it's just an absolute honor to be here, but also to have my translator here with folks to talk about that process. So it was a difficult little travail, but I'm so happy that we got to take that path together.
Jan, do you want to tell us a little bit about how you experienced that process? How you came to the project?
Yes, of course. So I came to the project, I guess, well, it's a pretty straightforward thing at the same time as it is not, I would say. So the French translation, like the French translation rights were like obtained by like small publishing house in Montreal, whose name is Mémoire d'Encrier, and I was already working with them on the translating other books, co-translating other books for them. As you mentioned, Leanne, Beta Samosak Simpson's like books of fiction and poetry, prose, poetry, whatever. And so I was already in a relationship with this publishing house, which already works a lot, like very closely with their translators, like as a small family. And we were building like a trusted relationship, I would say, with the editors there. And they got the rights for Jonny Appleseed. And so there's a translation committee there in Mémoire d'Encrier. And the translation committee there like usually reads the books and like sees if we want to translate them and who would be like a good fit with this or that book, this or that voice, like in terms of style and in terms of writing. And like the committee thought that I would be a good fit for this book primarily because it's very, very contemporary. And the language is very urban, and that like there's a lot of slang, which is Sophie, as you know, like a major. I hate to like it's framed as a problem for translation. I don't see it as a problem, but it is like a challenge for sure, because translation as a practice as a whole is largely like dominated by standard and normative ways of writing, and I am one of the, well, there's more and more of us now, but like an emerging translator that is comfortable and at ease with that kind of register. And so they thought that it would be a good fit because according to us, it was like one of the main challenges. And so I had read the book before and I was completely like in awe of Joshua, of that book, of Jonny. I mean, Jonny really like touched me straight to the heart when I first read the book. So when I was asked to participate to that project, I had to think about it a little bit because obviously like I have lived a very different life like than Jonny has lived, and there's a lot of differences that would have to be like there was a big gap for me that I would have to like overcome in that translation, and I had to make sure that I could actually put in the time, the efforts, and like to deconstruct like a lot of things on my end to be able to meet, you know, Jonny on his own terms. And I decided that I was indeed like ready and willing to do that. And so when Joshua was talking about like the care, like it made me smile, and I'm like so happy to hear you say that because it did feel like and I spent, you know, 8 or 10 months like on this project. It's like a long time, and I was like I remember like caring so deeply about this book, you know, and I was dreaming about it all the time, and it was just like it had become like my life sort of, and this little like we've been joking, Joshua and I, that it was like our baby, the French version, and it's true, like it felt like that I was like also like that Jonny was reborn sort of through like my own means and like my words. But yeah, so that's how I came to the project.
Thanks. Yeah, you did. I mean, anybody who's read the book will know how difficult, how, you know, the voice that you have, Joshua, it's just so, you know, modern and youthful, that you really need somebody who's modern and youthful to translate it. And I like that you put that much care. I mean, I think if we're as translators, if we're close to a project, it's so much easier for us to do the translation because we care about it, right? Not just because we're doing this because we're getting paid to do it, but because we care about the project and we want to make it. So tell us a little bit about how you guys collaborated. Did you have meetings or consultations? I mean, you touched upon it a little bit, Joshua, but like give us a little bit of behind the scenes of how the translation actually happens. I'll give you the mic first, Josh.
Sure. So we had meetings over email and text and phone call, and we had tried to set up several opportunities for us to get together and do the translation face to face or in person. So we had tried with the BAM Center. Ultimately, that had fallen through. And then we were given the opportunity for Arianne to come to Calgary for a week. And we had been working through the translation process already. Well, I've just been kind of giving. Arianne's really the one who's working. I was just like, yes, this works. But we had been collaborating on it for a while. And then we had the opportunity to get together in Calgary over a week. So we found Arianne at a beautiful little Airbnb nearby to my place, which is in the southeast of Calgary. And then first time we sat down, I just remember this. I think we went for like, it was an afternoon, summer. We went for like a pint at this little kind of indie pub and got some food. Arianne like dropped the book down, Jonny's book, and it was like dog-eared, and there was like all these little stickers, and I was like, this is like absolute majesty to me to see the book so tenderly loved and cared for, but also so like I would say like almost kind of engraved into, and just like so tenderly shown, Jonny being so tenderly shown like respect and adoration. So I remember seeing that book, he put it down on the table, and I was like, that is like the most notations I think I've ever seen in a single book. And we're both PhD students. I dog-ear my pages all the time, and I like to notate in them. So we sat down and we continued the process for a week. I would say it was almost 7 days. And we would spend handfuls of hours per day talking through the book. And Arianne had this like kind of to-do list, I would say. I was like, okay, let's start here in the beginning. And I think the really cool part for me was, in terms of like the kind of language, the tone, the style of the novel, which I would say is very much, for me, modern and contemporary, but very much not of the kind of expectation of what we might consider contemporary Canadian literature, or also the kind of formation and overall arc of a contemporary novel, right? Which is like the rising action, denouement, and then the climax. Mine was just like, I don't want that. And I can get into that a little later. But I knew it was going to be a difficult project. It was difficult for me to write. And it was difficult for me to kind of get in the headspace of Jonny, to birth Jonny, I guess I would say as well. But then also to write in the voice that he wanted. And I was like, I know I had a difficult time. I was like, how is someone else going to also capture this essence of a character who doesn't want to be held or captured in that sense? But yeah, we kind of had just talked through the entire book, and in terms of the language or the linguistics of the novel, I wanted Jonny to be like I really wanted to stay true to kind of the slang and the vernacular of how we kind of talk, I would say, in Treaty 1, which is, it's a mixture of Cree and of English, but then also of the, I would say, entanglements of those that's brought about through like vernacular such as slang. And there was always interesting convos we had. Specifically, the one I can recall off the top of my head in this moment was, in Treaty 1, we always say like, holy hell, like if something's like intense, or if something's also like over the top or extravagant, like you would just be like, holy hell, like settle down. Like that's what we would just kind of say. And I remember the question came up, it's like, oh, like, and it was very earnestly, in this very earnest way, like, oh, like what is the reliance on this term, holy hell? And no one had asked me that before. It was just like such a normalcy for me to say that I think the translation process was really interesting for me, because it asked me to kind of sit and ruminate on the slang that we use, I would say, in Treaty 1, specifically from Peguis First Nation. So I remember getting asked that question, holy hell, and I was like, yeah, what, why do we say that? Like, where does that come from? So yeah, it was, what I liked was that it asked me to kind of think about, because I was like, oh, I'm doing all this etymological roots or workings of English and Latin terms, but I never did it from my own language, I would say, my own linguistic system. And I think that was really the cool, interesting part, about the translation process was because we had to slow down. And then bringing someone else into that world really had to ask me to ruminate and think about what I might take for a normalcy, or what I might take for kind of an everyday use of language, such as slang. So I remember being asked, like, where does holy hell come from? And I was like, I don't know. And I remember sitting and thinking about that, and that's just one example of many in the book. But I was like, oh, for me, I think it's like a reclamation of like Christianity, and folks such as like Thomas King, and oh my goodness, I'm going to forget, Thompson Highway, really kind of write about how like Indigenous folks were always like deemed as pagans and geared towards this quote unquote idealization and idea of like hell. And I was like, oh, like, I think it's like a reclamation of that, of like celebrating. It's like, oh, we've kind of survived the worst. We've lived in torture chambers. We've survived an apocalypse. Now let's put kind of these two binaries together, holy and hell. And so it's like that for me, it was like really the cool process of the translation. It was like really kind of thinking about like slowing down and really kind of zoning in on like nouns and verbs, but like to really think about like why that's there. And maybe that's like the poetics of translation, I might say, from my end of the spectrum, was like, yeah, really like honing in on selections of word choices and thinking about why is that there, where does that come from, and how does that impact the story, right? Because I think those vernaculars and the slang really, that's how I characterize Jonny, and that's how I characterize the novel. But really honing in on that was like, I think for me, the most insightful part of the process, I would say.
Yeah, as an author, you turn into a little bit of an expert on translation through this process, right? And you're learning so much about your work and about our craft as translators, so it's interesting. Arianne, tell us about this process. Tell us about working with a real live author. I mean, one of the authors that I've translated has passed away, so I couldn't actually consult her. You've got such a richness of possibility with that.
Yes, absolutely. It was a tremendous pleasure and honor to do that. So Joshua isn't, the first author writer that I translate or co-translate, but he's the one that I could actually spend time with and meet. Not everyone is willing to spend a week with their translator. I get that. So sometimes, usually, if the writer is still alive, they'll answer your emails, and they're super nice. It's just not their job to grab a pint with you, and spend the day with you. But Joshua was very eager from the get-go, and we from the very start of the project, I got in touch with him. And he to introduce myself and say who I was, and if he felt comfortable with someone like me, doing the translation. So just as a backdrop, for people listening, in the translation industry, the writer doesn't really have a say on who translates them. Because it's a question of translation rights, and publishing houses decide that for everyone involved. So I personally practice, introducing myself from the beginning, just before I sign any contract, to see if the relationship, if we can both see ourselves in that rapport, right? And so from the get-go, we exchanged numbers, we started texting, and so I started translating. And over the course of several months, we exchanged emails, as Joshua said, and spoke on the phone, that kind of thing. And then after, when I was done with the first draft, I had so many questions, and as you said, Josh, in the book, so many notes, so many, I highlighted stuff that I wasn't sure or wanted to explore. And so I ended up flying to Calgary, which is another great thing about Mémoire d'Encrier. They were very generous and made that happen. So they paid for my flight, which is incredible. And I could go to Calgary for a week to work alongside my writer. And it was, for the translation, it was absolutely crucial. And I think it is one of the reasons why I think this translation is such like, well, I mean, it's my own translation, but I think it's really good because there's like so much love that was put into it, and collaboration and dialogue. And yeah, I remember like feeling for Joshua, and you wrote a little note too that we put into the translation where you say how you enjoyed that process. And for me as a translator, it was very special to see that, because usually translation often takes the form of a unilateral or like unidirectional relationship. Like that's not reciprocal. It's like I have a relationship with you, but you don't with me. And with Joshua, it was like a full circle kind of thing. And for me, that was beautiful. Like that you could get, because I get so much from the books that I translate. Like I get so much from sitting with those books for months. Like they change me, they transform me. And I was happy to see that like my work or like the work that we do together can change other people, including you. And I wanted to say one more thing. Yeah, it was also great to be able to like work so closely together, because so in translation, there's often like a lot of challenges, a lot of problems, a lot of losses. But there's also a lot of gains and a lot of really nice things that happen in translation. And for me, that was also like an occasion to share those with you, Josh. And like it sometimes it's just like silly, but I remember like telling you things like, you know, the Edward Munch's painting, The Scream. In French, it's le cri, which means like crie, like this. It's the same word. And I remember like it was just like these funny little things that emerged, you know, out of translation, or this particular sentence that I'm like so proud of. In English, it says, "When I think about masculinity, I think about femininity." Like that's one phrase, one sentence in the novel. But I translated in French because of the gendered nature of common words. I could translate in a different way that made it like even more powerful. And it's like it goes à mes yeux, something like that. La masculinité est un nom féminin, like is a feminine word because it is like grammatically. And so these like little moments, you know, that like you can do something with the language and the translation to be able to share that as well as all the like pitfalls and difficulties. Like it was like really positive for me. Yeah.
It's definitely made for a very rich translation that you did. One of the things about your translation, Arianne, is that it is into the Québécois, and I know Mémoire d'Encrier also has a very wide distribution network worldwide. Tell us a little bit about that choice of making it into Québécois. And just before that, I'll preface that by saying Eden Robinson was here a few years ago as a writer in residence. And I remember she was at that point writing one of her latest books. And she said to me, Sophie, she said, I want this to be translated into Québécois. I don't want it to be translated into French. And I thought that was really funny that she had actually considered that. So tell us about that decision. And Joshua, maybe afterwards you can tell us a little bit if you thought about that at all.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. It's a very complicated question. It's a fascinating one. It's a question where which creates like a lot of tensions that I find very productive. So it was obviously, so that's the kind in translation, in literary translation, that's the kind of decision that you make from the start. You know, it's like a macro. It's a strategy for the entirety of the book. So it's not like a micro decision anyway. And I remember like I think I remember actually like I think that I spoke to you about this, Joshua, like the idea of the register, the tone, the voice, and the kind of French. that I was planning on using, and why or how I was going to do that. So first, and I guess like this echoes what Robinson was saying to you, Sophie, is there's, for me, it was out of the question to translate that book into normative French, you know, like imperial French, that's like, comes out of mostly, you know, like the center of France, Paris. And so here, well, in Quebec, in Canada, we have various like varieties, if you will, of French that are more local, more subaltern compared to the normativity of French, like from France. And so for me, just because of the way this novel is written, like it is written in another imperial colonial language, but in a way, and Josh said a few words about that earlier, in a way that challenges the power of that language to define and describe everything, like, you know, around it. And so it was really important for me to deconstruct that in French as well. That being said, like I realize and I know that, you know, Québécois French is also a kind, in its own way, like a kind of new norm, that also, like, you know, there's always like norms everywhere that are imposed on speakers, you know, of any languages. And so that the Québécois variety is not in itself, you know, like this de facto like subversive French, like I know that. So it's still something, you know, and translating slang or translating into a non-normative language is very, very challenging. And I think we just have to like try different ways to do it. And this is all very new, I think, in translation. So trying different voices, trying different ways, calling upon different varieties that are minoritized, and there are other varieties of French that could have been used in translation for this translation. Like I'm in New Brunswick now, so Acadian French, for instance, would have been possible. But the thing is, Québécois French is the language that I know. So it's the one that I am most comfortable using, and without, like, you know, exoticizing or taking, just like using words just for the sake of their structural positioning, like in the language linguistic hierarchy. And so I decided to to choose the Québécois vernacular. Also because, so I did a lot of research too on that, and I watched a bunch of like documentaries with set in on reservations, for instance, to see, like, to listen to how elders, maybe like how they talk. And I thought, you know, like for sure there are differences, but like Indigenous people in Quebec or elsewhere in Francophone Canada who speak French, like they don't sound like people in France. Like they don't sound like they're from Paris, you know? They sound more like how I sound than people in France. So it was logical for me to do that. And I also was inspired by a few, well, I would say like mostly Marie-André Gill, a poet who writes in French, who is translated into English actually. And she writes like in a kind of language, I would say that's very similar to the one that I mobilized in Jonny Appleseed, like dépanneur, as you say, like it's just like a cultural reality here, whether you're Indigenous or not, you know. So yeah, but it is like there is a limit, I think, to the Québécois dialect. I am well aware of that, and trying to like work through the implications, you know. And yeah, I guess I'll stop there for now. Joshua, I don't know if you want to add anything, or.
Yeah, I would say like we had conversations around this, and I myself too had like I was noting earlier, some qualms and reservations around putting it into another kind of imperialistic linguistic system. But so like I think those were conversations we kind of had from the get-go. And this is also when I knew that Jonny was in good hands, both with the publishing house and with the translator, is because there was a history of translating Indigenous texts into Quebecois French. But there was also, I think, with Arianne, this beautiful way of thinking about like the ethics and the morals of how to translate in a way that best suits the novel, but also how to perhaps translate in a way that arcs towards the decolonial, I would say. So we had conversations around this quite a bit. And I would say like Jonny, yes, it is in English, but at the same time that English is fractured, it's messy, it leaks, it's broken. It's also very much coming out of like the backcountry or the reservation, right? Small town prairie. So it was important to keep those, but also into the translation process, and this is something beyond my purview, but also to like keep it in a way that the language in whatever language it's going to be in, like the language of the novel, whatever linguistic system it's going to be in, is also going to maintain that like fracturedness, the brokenness. And I think that was the best way that we could do it, with kind of like the prowess of Arianne, is like using perhaps, yeah, using maybe more of like a bricolage, I would say. Like the translation and the language was more like, yeah, a bricolage or like a scrapbook almost, which is very true to the character and the tone of the novel itself. And there was also like a lot to think about. So when Arianne was talking about that translated sentence, there was conversations we had to have as well, because one, I was writing in an English vein, but two, my understanding of like, I would say language and gender is very different as a kind of Cree person speaking English, because in like Nehiyowin or the Cree language, like we don't have genders. And I apply that to how I think and write and move through the world. So like, even though I'm having to kind of engender things in English, my understanding and perhaps my play with it is to think about how I may animate that in a way that is either undoing some of that gendered language, or also just like playing with it, making it a little more fluid. So like, I would say it was really interesting in like how the translation process went. If one, because I wanted to, and I think we wanted to maintain like that fracturedness, the fluidity. Two, there was also a lot of conversations that were needed to be had about how do we translate this, knowing that Josh was thinking about it from a non-gendered perspective into a gendered language, into one that's perhaps even hyperbolically gendered, such as French. So like those conversations that were had, and the product that was produced from that, I think came out in the most polished fashion it could have, for thinking about a book that is, I would say, refuses to be polished, and wants you to kind of see all of the ridges and the fractures and the brokenness of it, because that's, for me, that's just how I see the book as a whole. So I think, yeah, I really am happy with the process that we went, and maybe not keeping it in the vein of like a kind of Parisian French, but keeping it more in the tone of like the rurality, I guess I would say, of Quebecois French. And I think it suited the novel as best as it could. I think for me, it worked wonderfully. And I would say perhaps in the process of both myself and Arianne is like thinking about like what we also had to unlearn in English, Cree, and French to produce a text that wanted to be, I would say, like misunderstood or misrecognized at times, because I would say that that's kind of when it's like a fun house. Like that's when you get to peek into like the kind of the reality of the character that we wrote and have, Jonny.
Arianne, you wanted to add something, please go ahead.
Yes. I just wanted to add also that, you know, the language in which I rewrote or like translated the book is not, you know, like an identical version of the language that I speak on the street, or that like it's not a sociolinguistic, you know, mirror of how people speak in Quebec. Like, it's also an invention. And there's like a lot of places in the book where I like made up expressions, you know, based on Joshua's lexical choices. And like, if we take holy hell, for instance, the reason why we talked about it so much is that I didn't really see like a readily equivalent, right? And so I had to like, and I decided to make one up. Like, I could have just used a swear words in Quebec, you know, like that would have worked maybe, but I did, I used sacré calvaire. It's a literal translation, literally like holy hell, sacré calvaire. And it makes sense. People will read that and be like, okay, yeah, no, like I know what you mean, but like people don't say that necessarily. So it was also like a work of a bricolage, yeah, from like existing, you know, expressions to like made up or imagined, you know, phrasings based on like the original like expressions, for instance, and a lot like several registers and voices, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Joshua, I don't know if you're able to read it in French, but as someone who is able to read it in French, you know, Arianne did such a great job. One of the things that I was thinking about as you were both speaking was that, you know, you could definitely read this book, and if you didn't know where Peguis First Nation was, you could think that it was a First Nation in Quebec. And I think that's kind of speaks to the ability that Arianne has to kind of translate it into a French that makes it such that it's adaptable to whatever, you know, audience that's reading it, which is nice. And just to pick up on what you were saying about sort of that dominant language, I think there's also that, you know, whereas Joshua, you wrote the book to disturb, you know, the literary canon of Canada, I think there's also a lot of space to disturb, you know, the books published in French don't necessarily all need to be in standard French. And so by provoking with this, you know, hybrid bricolage translation, it's making it a lot more interesting for readers as well, you know, challenging them to actually understand, which is a big thing. So in saying that, I mean, Joshua, you called your book a bio story and has a large part of autobiographical content. And I think it's interesting that, you know, you braided your life into the story, which makes for this added layer of complication for Arianne as the translator. So Josh, if you want to comment a little bit on this autobiographical component, and maybe Arianne can talk about how this made it a little bit more complicated on her side.
Yeah. So it's a bit, when I do a lot of workshops, I want to give a lot of talks. I always kind of say, like, for like BIPOC, queer, or women writers or disabled writers or any intersection, that I don't have the ability. Let me just hold this up so I can make the notation. like there's a lot of, I would say, like white male cis writers who have the ability to write about aesthetics, or can write about kind of sonnets about the sky, or like the kind of the sheen of a glass, or how beautiful the teacup is, which is fine and dandy. I don't think that makes good writing, but I would say for a lot of BIPOC writers, like, I don't have the ability to dissociate like this body I call mine from the body of text that is Jonny. And perhaps this is just like my Cree or Indigenous way of thinking too, but without genders in our language, we animate things. And in animating them, we're very much accountable to them. So like a body of water, a body of land, sky, etc. And I would say that Jonny is an animation of mine that I'm very much accountable to. So I don't think I have the ability to dissociate this body from that body of text that is Jonny. In such a way that I would say, like, Jonny and I almost have like an umbilical cord between us, that we feed each other in that sense. So like, yes, Jonny is a work of fiction, but I would kind of call it biofiction or biotextual, if only because Jonny is an ojibwé-crie two-spirit person from Peguis First Nation, which is the same as mine. But he's also a character that's kind of lived in me or with me for like well over a decade. And in that time, I've like fed him trauma, I fed him joy, I fed him experiences, and to the point that he became nourished enough to become a full-fledged character who had his own story to tell. And in his telling of his own story, Jonny, because of that kind of oroboric or umbilical sharing, it very much became imbricated with my own life, to the point that Jonny and T.S., like the other secondary character in the novel, they're both fictional characters, but there are like really there are painful or like beautiful moments in which Jonny and T.S. very much mirrored myself and my previous long-term partner, that it became difficult to sometimes to dissociate between Jonny and Josh. And I always tell this little funny story that I explicitly say it is a novel, it is fiction, but I do kind of give the preface that it's biotextual in that sense. And I have to do that, if only because there have been moments in my life, more so of recent, where people have either in meeting or passing called me Jonny, but also in very intimate moments, people I've been casually seeing have like referred to me as Jonny, and I was like, I'm Joshua. But I can get how people would read it as kind of autobiography. It's very much not, and I'm very happy to kind of set that scene of Jonny and Josh. They kind of share this webbing, but then I also think quite heavily on the ethics of that as well, for readerships, and I would say primarily non-Indigenous readerships, and even more specifically like white readerships, who often read the works of BIPOC or queer or women writers, and those intersections as confession. So also trying to kind of wrangle with that at the same time. So I set that scene that Jonny and I kind of share these moments, and share a house that I might call a body, but also share a house that is a novel. But also trying to like kind of untangle some of the ways in which that people read me as Jonny himself, but then also read the larger kind of ethical question of writing by BIPOC or Black Indigenous folks of color as confession. And it almost becomes a type of voyeurism, to the point that I'm happy that I wrote this character, Jonny, who very much plays with those ideas of voyeurism and strategic essentialism, or kind of playing the part of the quote unquote Indian to make this money. That I think it's because of him, and I would say the translation process, that I began to like have to think about these questions of confession and autobiography or autofiction or biotext, as Fred Waugh might say, to the point that now I can see this in what kind of the larger industry we might call Canadian literature, and start to question it, and not make so much of an allowance, that one may pay $18.95 for a text and feel like they have unbridled access to the writer's life, or the behind the scenes voyeurism, or also to ask really kind of impersonal and unethical questions, such as folks have asked me in like when I was doing the launches for Jonny, like tell me about like the real life death of your grandmother or aunt, because I know that it's informed it. And I was like, what gives you the, like, no one's asking Margaret Atwood that, like no one was asking, like other folks those types of questions. So that's another kind of entanglement that I'm wrestling with. But to bring it back in terms of like, it's also for me, in saying that Jonny and Joshua share experiences and pain and triumphs and loss, that when we were doing the translation process, this was very much when I was in like the kind of haze of my breakup, and as we kind of got to do this, what I thought was so beautiful, and perhaps this is the kind of the joy of having a character who's so very much connected to your life, is that as Arianne and I were going through the translation process and really kind of honing in on details and the language and the tone and the style, it was almost as, for me, I was like, oh, like I was like writing these little things I needed to hear. So Jonny was written about a year and a half prior to the translation process. Flash forward to the present moment, which was last year, while we were doing the translation, I was like, oh, there's like little tidbits of like knowledge or like little experiences or like morals that I needed to learn that I forgot about. So like we had this conversation. I was like, oh, like Jonny, even though he's published and put into print, is like almost like still teaching me as Joshua. That I think that was also a really beautiful process, and also a really kind of interesting insight into what happens when you kind of share a body, my body, the body of text, and what happens with that kind of umbilical connection is that there's still continue, like, even though the book is in print, there was still so much to learn, I would say, and still so much to be taught from myself, but also from my characters. So,
But
yeah.
also from your book, right, Joshua? I think that's the important thing. So what
Exactly.
remains in the book, yeah. Arianne, did you struggle with this part of the autobiographical nature at all when you were doing the translation?
I think maybe you will find my answer a bit boring because the truth is, so I first like read this, you know, as it is marketed, a novel. No, like at first, that's not the kind of relationship that I built personally with this book. I also didn't know like Joshua very well. So I was like, Jonny was Jonny, you know, and then once we started learning to know each other a bit more, and like eventually when we met, and I mean, I follow Joshua on social media, and sometimes he puts like little snippets of like back home, and then it makes me like similar sometimes to stuff that's in Jonny Appleseed. So like I started seeing, you know, similarities, but obviously like you write about what you know, or what, like, I mean, so I wasn't surprised at all, but I can't say that it was a challenge for me, the like biofiction part, because I guess I would say very quickly that when I translate a book, in spite of how it's marketed, or like how the kinds of like, is it autobiographical, is it not, I just really focus on the text, you know, like the text as its own micro, as its own entity, and I just really focus like about what's in there and how it plays out on the page. And so whether or not like this has I don't know, recognized links to the real, like that's not my object of study, or of that's not what I translate. What I translate is like the relationship between the words and the different parts, and
I personally find that sometimes, I mean, I've never had the experience of writing directly with an author the same way that you have, Arianne, but I think that there's also kind of that part of lived experience that the author has had that you might not have had, that you can ask, right? So maybe you've never been to Peguis First Nation, and so you can ask Joshua, like, you know, when you describe this section, like, I didn't necessarily understand what it looked like, can you, you know, it lives in Joshua's mind much more easily than it would live in your mind as a translator. So I mean, in my case, like having that that like possibility is always like a dream. Yeah, really a dream. So our time is coming to an end, but I do want to ask you before we move on about your future projects. Joshua, you mentioned making love with the land. I'd love to hear a little bit more about him. I'd love to know, are we going to see Jonny again? And Arianne, your next translation projects, we'd love to hear about them. So maybe I'll turn it over to Arianne first.
Sure. Well, I just finished a translation, actually, that's it's the translation of an essay that's called Feminist City, and it's by a prof here in Sackville, New Brunswick, geography. It's like a feminist geography like book on cities. That should come out, I think, in the winter, actually. And then my next project will be to work. It's a very a project that's very close to my heart, such as working with Joshua. But it would be it's going to be the translation of Leanne's novel that just came out or is coming out, Nous, sommes, The Cure for White Ladies. So I'm very excited to get on that, because that would be the third book that I translate by Leanne, and so I'm like very used to working with her and her thinking. So yeah, that's it for me.
So we have lots to look forward to then in the translations. Joshua, please tell us about your next projects. When are we going to be able to see some more of your beautiful writing?
Yeah, so as you noted earlier, I just released the anthology with Arsenal Pulp, Love After the End, which is an anthology of speculative fiction by two-spirit or Indigenous queer folk. So I'm very excited to have that into the world, because that was a whole process of trying to have also 9 contributors. And then I'm also finishing up a manuscript entitled, as you noted, Making Love with the Land, which is a collection slated to be released, hopefully, with COVID-19 and everything that's been going on. Fall 2021 with Knopf Canada. And that's a book of creative nonfiction that details indigeneity, primarily queerness again, mental health, and queerness. So like thinking about things such as like insomnia, depression, youth suicides, but then also because I'm just like a full-fledged Indigen nerd, there's also like talking about like horror films, video games, again, pop culture comes up. And so I always kind of say all my books are like sibling stories. Like Full Metal led me into Johnny. Johnny's really led me into this book. There's a line in Johnny where his grandmother's teaching him that a humility is just a humiliation you loved so much it transformed. And like that was kind of like the bridge that led me to this next book. It really kind of thinking about, okay, if we don't have gender in our languages, if we animate pain, like can we make love to that? So it just for me seemed like the next natural progression, even though I keep switching genres. But I think this was the most ethical way for me to tell this story. So yeah, fall 2021 with Knopf Canada. It's nearly finished, so finally.
Well, we're definitely looking forward to it. I really want to thank both Joshua and Arianne for being with us for this WordFeast event. It was really a pleasure to chat with you about this magnificent work, the excellent translation that Arianne did, which I hope sees a lot more recognition. I mean, it's already been covered in a few, reviewed in a few newspapers, but definitely needs to be read by more people because it's an excellent translation. And I'd like to invite everyone to the next WordFeast event, which is taking place September 26th at 7 p.m. And it's celebrating Bill and Nancy Bauer, hosted by Brian Bartlett. And it's going to be an event, of course, these are longstanding figures of the New Brunswick literary community, and I will be celebrating them. Thank you very much to both Arianne and Joshua, and have an excellent day.